Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to today's tutorial. Now today we want to look at the larynx. We already looked at the pharynx, that's the truth, the name I'll call it. Today we want to look at the larynx. And it's going to span all the way from the vertebral level C3 all the way to C6. Apart from conditioning the air, it's also going to be very important as far as phonation, articulation of sound is concerned, as one speaks. After all, that's why the layman will call it the voice box. Now remember that this voice box, or the larynx we are talking about, yes, will also actually perform the function of ensuring that food particles or water doesn't get to the airway by way of protecting it. So we look at some of the cartilages that the larynx present with. It's going to have 3 paired and 3 unpaired, some being made of hyaline cartilage, others being of elastic cartilage. We will look at all those ones. But of course, there is sometimes another cartilage structure which we will see, that is the cartilago tritechia. Surprisingly, this cartilage structure is also there, which sometimes it becomes bony. So some even authorities think that it should be separate cartilage on its own if it is cartilaginous, actually hyaline cartilage. We look at all these things. Remember that yes, this larynx will actually have what we call extrinsic muscles, extrinsic muscles, which will tend to either depress or elevate the larynx. We look at all these ones. Yes, apart from these ones, we also are going to have the intrinsic muscles. We are going to look at them. Then we're also going to have what we call membranes. Well, in the midline, these membranes were taken to become ligaments, which we are going to look at them. And of course, we are also going to see the relations where we have the hyoid bone, as well as inferior. We're going to have the trachea. So without wasting my time, yes, let's look at the voice box. Now remember, even with the voice box, we are going to have the vestibule portion, which we saw in the case of the pharynx. We're going to see it again. We're also going to see actually the inlet, the laryngeal inlet, which we're going to see that. So vestibule, or the supra glottic component. Then of course we are going to see the ventricle, yes, or the glottic component actually. Then of course infraglottic or subglottic part, yes, also being there. So let's look at the journey of the larynx. So as we were saying, we are going to have actually the vestibule portion of it. There's the laryngeal inlet. There's the vestibular portion, which was span actually from the upper margin of the epiglottis to actually where we have what we call the vocal folds, and in between the vocal folds we have what we call the glottic, the glottis actually. Now this piece is actually known as rima glottidis. And of course from the these vocal folds all the way to the lower border of the cricoid cartilage, we are going to have what we call the infraglottic component. Now, by way of orientation, yes, as you can see this, by way of orientation, we are going to have this superior bone being the hyoid bone, U-shaped bone. Yes, it's going to bear these lesser palmar that we've seen, then which orient actually superiorly, and then we're also going to have the posteriorly orienting ones being the greater horns or the greater cornua. This area represents the body of the hyoid bone. Then of course we're also going to have this area being the larynx, and of course below that we are going to have the tracheal rings. Now what we are going to see is that when you look at now, the larynx is going to have 3 paired cartilages and 3 unpaired cartilages. Now let's look at the 3 unpaired cartilages. The 3 unpaired cartilages superiorly, you can see this cartilage. This cartilage is known as the epiglottic cartilage or the epiglottis. Now epiglottis internally is going to have a tubercle. The tubercle of the epiglottis will be here. Yes, and this shaped like leaf. It's a leaf-shaped structure. It's going to be very important whenever food particles is about entering the throat. Then it has to sense it. It's having what we call salivary it's having some taste buds, so that I can sense that food is coming, so that it will quickly flap to close the entrance of the airway. So actually having to protect protective function. And of course, that's the reason why we are advised not to talk while we eat. Now, the next one, this is actually made of elastic cartilage. The next one we find, which is also single, is the largest cartilaginous structure that we find in the larynx, and this is known as the thyroid cartilage. The thyroid cartilage. Now, the thyroid cartilage is going to have also horns. Going to have a superior horn or superior cornua, two of them. So singular is cornus, and then it's also going to have inferior cornus. Now, over here, it's going to have what we call superior tubercle, and of course, it also have an inferior tubercle on either side. So superior tubercle, and there will be an inferior tubercle as well. Now again, it's going to present with these plates, flat plates known as laminae. So these laminae will actually join in the midline anteriorly to form what we call the laryngeal prominence. Now this laryngeal prominence is what in males is quite more prominent, therefore we give the name as Adam's apple. Remember that as the two laminae come and meet, they create this notch known as superior laryngeal notch, and inferiorly the laminae also create a notch known as inferior laryngeal notch or thyroid notch. But of course, these ones, they are not well appreciated, the inferior one, but the superior one is well appreciated. Now remember that this bone is not complete. It does not form a complete ring at the posterior aspect. It is devoid of that kind of part. Now what you will find is that in between the greater cornua and then the superior cornua, greater cornua of the hyoid bone, cornus of the hyoid bone, and the superior cornus of the thyroid cartilage, we are going to have another cartilaginous structure over here, and this cartilaginous structure is known as Cartilago-Trititia. It's actually made of hyaline cartilage, but it could be bony. And of course, in between them there will be a joint over here, which will be the lateral. By way of ligament connecting them, lateral, thyrohyoid ligament, lateral thyrohyoid ligament connecting them. How we name these structures are based on the articulating structures. That makes it very simple. So that is what we find with the thyroid cartilage. It's also unpaired. Now at the inferior level, now remember that let's talk about these ones, the membranes. As I move on, I'll talk about the membranes. Now I'll talk about the muscles separately, connecting the body as well as the greater cornua of the hyoid bone to the superior margin of the thyroid cartilage. We are going to have what we call the thyrohyoid membrane. Now this thyrohyoid membrane in the midline will thicken to form what we call thyrohyoid ligament. So we are going to find thyrohyoid membrane, of course, thickening over here to form what we call thyrohyoid ligament. So that's what we are going to find. Now remember that this elastic cartilage, being the epiglottis, will connect to the thyroid cartilage, at the superior, thyroid notch or superior laryngeal notch over here, by way of this ligament, what you call it, the thyroepiglottic, ligament. Thyroepiglottic ligament. So that's what we are going to find over there. Now this bone is also unpaired, and it's also this hyaline cartilage. Thyroid cartilage is made of hyaline cartilage. The inferior bone that we find is the cricoid cartilage. Cricoid cartilage. Now it's also made of hyaline cartilage. Now what we find is that anteriorly it's having a smaller portion. The anterior portion is smaller. Look at the thickness from here to here is smaller compared to the posterior aspect, which spans all the way from here to here. and therefore we call the anterior portion arch, of the cricoid cartilage, arch of the cricoid cartilage. And then the posterior portion, which is very large, we call it the lamina of the cricoid cartilage. So actually it's the only cartilage of the larynx which is able to span all the way from the anterior portion to the posterior aspects. As you can see, spanning all the way. Now what we find is that yes, on the lamina on the lateral sides, it provides articular facet for the inferior conua. Yes, there are two of the thyroid cartilage, to articulate with it. And on its superior portion too, it also has articulation surface for another cartilage which we'll talk about pretty soon. That's the arytenoid cartilage. So we've seen that three unpaired cartilages that we've seen. We've seen the elastic cartilage being the epiglottis. We've also seen the thyroid cartilage is also unpaired. Then we've also seen the cricoid cartilage being unpaired. But these two, cricoid and thyroid, are made of hyaline cartilage. Now, what of the elastic, what of the paired cartilages? For the paired cartilages, yes, you can see this triangular shaped pyramidal structure that you find here. As you can see, this is known as arytenoid cartilage, sitting on the superior aspects of the cricoid cartilage. So this is known as arytenoid cartilage. This arytenoid cartilage is made of hyaline cartilage, except at the most apical portion being elastic cartilage. Now, what we find is that it's going to have what we call an apex superiorly and a base inferiorly, sitting on the superior portion of the cricoid cartilage. Now, what we find is that at the base is going to actually have what we call the muscular process, so that muscles will attach over here. So it's going to have muscular process as well. Then of course, it's also going to have what we call the area which is going to articulate with the vocal area, which we call it, the vocal process, because it's going to articulate, actually have articulation point with the vocal ligament and course over here. So that's what we are going to find. So it's going to have three main processes. The apex is going to have, yes, the muscular process where muscles will attach, and then of course it's also going to have what we call the vocal process as well. Now, sitting on top of these arytenoid cartilages are also triangular shaped small bones, which we call them corniculate cartilages. Now, there is another set of cartilages which are also paired, and that is what we call cuneiform cartilages. Now, for cuneiform cartilages, we are not going to find it here. But what happens is that if you remember, we said there is what we call airy epiglottic fold. There is airy epiglottic fold, which is over here, and airy epiglottic between arytenoid cartilage and of course epiglottis. So that's what we call airy epiglottic fold. Over there, that's the inferior margin of what we call a membrane we call the quadrangular membrane. Within it is going to find these kind of ligaments, which we call them cuneiform cartilages. Now remember that these cuneiform cartilages are also made of elastic cartilage. Now, so let's find out these muscles. Now, importantly, over here between the thyroid cartilage and the superior portion of the cricoid cartilage anteriorly, we are going to find what we call the cricothyroid membrane. Now, it was taken in the midline to form what we call cricothyroid ligament. And of course, on the lateral portion of this ligament is what we call conus elasticus. They are cone-shaped, elastic, fibers. Actually, part of what we call the cricothyroid membrane. Conus elasticus. Now, this area has clinical importance. Yes, in emergencies where endotracheal intubation cannot be established, for breathing to occur, and then what happens is that then it has to go through the skin. So we cut through the skin to cut this membrane, which is the thyroid, cricothyroid, membrane, so that we establish flow of air in there. which in a process we call cricothyrotomy. Cricothyrotomy. So that's what we are going to find over here. All right. Now, if we look at the larynx is going to have two groups of muscles. Now we said something that there are going to be these ligaments that I talked about, which we find them here. These ligaments which are within, for instance, we are going to find it. This, cricothyroid ligament is an or it's an intrinsic, intrinsic ligament of the larynx. Now those ones which are between other structures and the component of the larynx are going to be extrinsic, ligament. So for instance, talking about, the thyroid ligament is an extrinsic, ligament, an extrinsic ligament. All right. Now one other thing that we can show over here, which muscles were attached on the thyroid cartilage, are these things we call them oblique lines. Oblique lines, which important some ligaments are going, some muscles, are going to attach them. So we look at these ones. Now, for one, this muscle is actually an extrinsic muscle, which of course we are going to call it thyroid ligament. Thyroid ligament. Now, generally, yes, extrinsic muscles, most of them are going to be the strap muscles, the inferior muscles, which we look at when we look at the triangles of the neck. But notably, some of them will include stenohyoid, sternothyroid, yes, omohyoid, yes, inferior constrictor, as well as stylopharyngeal muscles. But we'll look at all those ones in detail later. But important, the one which is shown over here is what we call the thyrohyoid, thyrohyoid muscle, thyrohyoid muscle. And this thyrohyoid muscle, is going to function when it contracts. It's going to help, depress actually or fix, the hyoid, and the larynx, together. So that's what is going to happen. Now, so that's one of the extrinsic muscles we've seen. But importantly, we want to look at the intrinsic muscles of the larynx. Now, we will find this muscle, which will span all the way, from actually the inferior tubercle, as well as, the inferior horn one of, the thyroid, cartilage, all the way to, the anterior arch, the arch of, the cricoid cartilage. This, muscle is going to be cricothyroid, muscle, cricothyroid muscle. Now you can see that each fibers, you can divide them into two main parts. The portion which is almost vertically placed, and therefore we call this one the vertical portion, or the straight, part, muscle of the cricothyroid, muscle. And then this one becomes the oblique part of the cricothyroid, muscle. Now this cricothyroid, muscle is very important. Yes, because it's going to cause what we call forward, as well as downward movement, of the thyroid cartilage. Forward as well as downward movement of the thyroid cartilage. Now, if it does that, then in turn, it's going to cause tension. You're going to stretch what we call the vocal ligament. You're going to stretch, the vocal ligament to actually increase, the pitch of sound. This muscle, it can also help, in changing the tone of sound or voice, and therefore we also call it the singer's, muscle, the singer's muscle. So the singer's muscle is the cricothyroid, muscle, the singer's muscle, cricothyroid muscle. And this is the muscle which, it's able to, actually, it's going to be innervated by what we call the external, what we call laryngeal, nerve, external laryngeal nerve. Actually, yes, these, intrinsic muscles are going to be, innervated by what we call the recurrent laryngeal nerve, which are actually, branch of the vagus nerve. The recurrent laryngeal nerve is generally going to innervate these intrinsic muscles of the larynx, except the singer's muscle, which is the cricothyroid, muscle, cricothyroid muscle. Now, one other thing that we are going to find, is that we're also going to find what we call, let's look at these ones. Let me show you these ones. Over here, if you can see these ones, this is the cricoid posterior aspect, so this is the lamina of the cricoid cartilage. So connecting from this area to actually the muscular process of the arytenoid cartilage is going to be Arytenoid cartilage. But there are two of them. There's another one which are run laterally over here. We look at that one, and therefore this one, because it's run posteriorly, we are going to call it posterior, Arytenoid cartilage. The posterior Arytenoid cartilage is the only, what we call the, abductor of the airway of the laryngeal inlet. So the only abductor of the laryngeal inlet, so that yes, it helps open the airways, actually open the vocal folds. Yes, so that's the only abductor moving them away, so that there will be space within it to enter the rhyma glottis. So that is the posterior posterior cricoarytenoid muscle. Then on the lateral aspects, there is another muscle on the lateral aspect, okay, which originate from actually the muscular process of the same arytenoid cartilage. Yes, to actually get into the the arch of what we call the cricoid cartilage, and that will be the lateral cricoarytenoid cartilage, lateral cricoarytenoid cartilage. And this lateral cricoarytenoid cartilage is going to perform a good antagonist to the posterior cricoarytenoid cartilage, and therefore this one will actually be the main adductor, of the laryngeal inlet, main adductor. So that's what we find. Yes, there are other muscles. There are other muscles that we find here. Now this muscle, which you can see spanning all the way, again, it's going to be from the vocal process of the arytenoid cartilage all the way to the internal aspect of the lamina of the thyroid cartilage. Then we are going to find what we call the thyroarytenoid cartilage. Now this thyroarytenoid cartilage, yes, what it's going to do is that it's also going to give off some fibers. It will give off some fibers to attach to the the epiglottis, and therefore those fibers will help depress the epiglottis, helping to close the airways during swallowing of food. So this one is going to be those fibers that is going to give off, who also be called, we can call it thyroepiglottic muscles, but the actual superior fibers coming from the the thyroarytenoid muscle. And yes, this thyroarytenoid muscle is mainly going to relax the vocal folds. But around this area, some books will write that yes, part of it will be the vocalis muscle, portion of it medially placed will be the vocalis muscle of this thyroarytenoid muscle, so that yes, it will help in phonation. But medial to this vocalis muscle, if present, you can see over here, will be the vocal ligaments. These white areas that we find here will be the vocal ligaments. And of course, we are going to have what we call, they will help tense the vocal folds, to actually increase the pitch of sound. Well, there are other ones that we don't really find them here, but notably will be the airy epiglottic muscle, which will tend to close the laryngeal inlet. So it's related to the airy epiglottic fold that we saw, which that one too will be there. But importantly, we talk about vocal folds. And vocal folds, we have what we call the vestibular fold, which is supposed to be around this area, which is not shown in this method. There's going to have the vestibular fold or the false vocal fold. And remember that all these, the laryngeal part of these, but they are actually going to be lined by what we call pseudostratified columnar epithelial tissue, with a lot of goblet cells, as well as cilia. They are going to help condition the air, But except another fold which is at a lower level, we can't really see them here, but that is the rhyma glottis that you can see, the opening part, and that is what we call the true vocal folds, or the true vocal cords. And those ones, upon vibration, will cause increase in the pitch, of sound. That true vocal folds is the only portion which is actually lined by stratified squamous, non-keratinized, epithelial tissue. Stratified squamous, non-keratinized epithelial tissue. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope this tutorial was helpful. Thank you very much for our audience. Alright, please look at these ones. There is this muscle as well, which we call it, the transverse, arytenoid muscle, because it runs from, the posterior aspect of one arytenoid, cartilage to the other. There's also an oblique one, and what they are going to do is to help adduct, pull them together, adduct these arytenoid cartilages. Just to end with, now the inferior portion, we have these C-shaped incomplete rings of cartilage. They are incomplete ring. That's the tracheal rings. Yes, there's also going to be another membrane over here. That will be the cricoid, tracheal membrane will be here. But of course, importantly is that the posterior aspect will run the esophagus. The esophagus always collapse except when food is entering it. During that time, if the bolus of food is too much, then it can actually, if these rings of cartilage were complete, then it will obstruct swallowing actually in the esophagus. Therefore, they are incomplete over here. So that's one thing that we find. All right. So thank you for your audience.